then I'm going to just go ahead and go through this PowerPoint. Okay, so in a sense, this is set up for the AP exam, but I think it's still relevant. So what we're going to look at is some specific water issues at different locations around the world. A lot of them in the US, but also in China and Eastern Europe. And um, then we have, lessons we can learn from these things. Africa, Arabia. So basically, when we're looking at water or other things too, we want to consider that there's two different kinds of issues to keep in mind. There are water quantity issues, and there are also water quality issues. So I encourage you to take notes and submit those to me for points when we're done. So quantity and quality basically refer to the amount of something and then to how good it is. So, for example, your grades are actually dependent both on the quantity of work, the amount of work that you turn in, but not just that, how good it is, the quality of the work you turn in. Similarly, with these water issues, there are some places that primarily have an issue with water quantity. The amount of water is having an impact on wildlife, the ecosystem, and people. In other places, it's less about the amount of water and more about the quality of the water. How clean is the water? How good is the water? Sometimes there's both of these at once. So we're going to look at these 12 case studies one at a time. The closest one to us is number one, Pyramid Lake. And then you can see that we're going to kind of jump around the world a bit. So Pyramid Lake gets its water from Tahoe. So the water flows down the Truckee River to Pyramid Lake, and that is on the Paiute Reservation. The people of Pyramid Lake have always lived there as long as memory can go back. Probably thousands of years there have been Native Americans living around the shores of Pyramid Lake. It is a terminal lake. It does not have an outlet. So water that ends up in Pyramid, because also it's in the desert, there's a high evaporation rate. And as the water evaporates, it leaves any minerals behind, and so they become more concentrated and it gets a little salty. So it's part of the Great Basin. It does not have an outlet, does not ever reach the sea. Pyramid is a small fragment of this huge lake called Lake Lahontan that once covered a lot of northwest Nevada during the ice ages. There is a modern lake called the Lahontan Reservoir near Fallon, and it is not the same thing. They're both named after the same French explorer, though. I'll show you a map of Lake Lahontan in a minute. At Pyramid Lake, it's habitat for two important fish. One is the Lahontan cutthroat trout, and these can get as big as a salmon. And they used to also be found in Tahoe. And they were so tasty that people were catching them by the dozens and the hundreds, and even exporting them on using trains to go to restaurants in like San Francisco and Chicago. And so we overfished the cutthroat trout out of Tahoe, and they are now extinct here. Actually, we would have raised some Tahoe trout from eggs in the classroom if the classroom had remained open. So that's a typical activity I do at this time of year. And then we release them into the lake in hopes that they can reestablish. The only thing is, when we release them, they're only about an inch long. And so any other adult trout of different species will eat them up. So the Lahontan cutthroat trout was the only native species in Tahoe. Now they're extinct and they've been replaced by these other introduced species like the Mackinaw trout from the Great Lakes and rainbow trout and so forth. Now in Pyramid Lake, there's another very interesting fish called the kiwi-yui. Now we usually just say kiwi, but in Paiute, it's pronounced kiwi-yui. And they are found nowhere else in the world. That's the meaning of endemic, right? So that kind of makes them automatically endangered. And they were really important to the Paiute people. Let's see what we got here. Okay, so the kiwi-yui were important to the Paiute people because they were a major part of their way of life. Now think about living out in the desert of Nevada. Not a lot of food sources, and so the best way to survive is to live in very small groups, which means you have not much of a social life beyond your family. Well, it turns out that these fish, the kiwi-yui, when they spawn in the spring, there are hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of them swimming up the Truckee River. And there were tales of how during spawning season you could walk across the river on the backs of the fish without getting wet feet, or the river would be black because there were so many fish in there. And so the Paiute people knew this, and all these family groups that were distributed across northern Nevada would gather at Pyramid Lake to catch kiwi, and they would dry them out as a food source for the rest of the year. And so in the springtime when they spawn, it was an incredible gathering of people. So it was more than just about food. It was also renewing social ties and seeing friends that you hadn't seen for 9 or 10 months. You know, it would have been an amazing time for them, really important for their society. Well, all that changed, particularly after 1905. So in 1905, a dam was built across the Truckee River about halfway between Reno and Pyramid Lake, and that diverted water away from the Truckee River to Fallon. And the farmers in Fallon then used the water for their crops. This was part of something called the Newlands Project, which took place in 1905. So they built a canal and this dam. So there's a dam across the Truckee River. It is not used for electricity. It has not made a reservoir. It basically just splits the river in half. About half the water goes to Fallon every year that used to go to Pyramid Lake. So that was great for the Fallon farmers, but it hurt Pyramid Lake and the Pyramid Lake Paiute people, who actually named themselves after the fish that they ate. Their name for themselves is Kiwi-yui Tokata. So Tokata is a common name for different bands of Paiute in Nevada, and it means the eaters of something. So there's another group of Paiutes that are the pine nut eaters. Well, these guys were the kiwi eaters. So how did that hurt the Paiute people? Well, because it hurt the fish. So here's some of the impacts a century later. The level of the lake dropped 80 feet. Imagine Tahoe dropping 80 feet. I notice it when it drops a couple of feet. But to drop 80 feet, that'd be amazing. There used to be an overflow from Pyramid every spring, or at least in high water years. When the water came down from the mountains, it would overflow from the Truckee River before it got to Pyramid Lake, and that filled up a nearby valley, which was named Winnemucca Lake. It's not right next to the town of Winnemucca. However, this lake was a great spot for wildlife, in particular migratory birds, waterfowl, ducks, and things like that. And so it was named a wildlife refuge in the 30s. But about a decade later, it was no longer considered a wildlife refuge because it had dried up. the overflows that used to feed Winnemucca Lake stopped. And so it just kind of faded into the desert. It was never a deep lake in the first place. Another impact was that as the water level dropped, the river slowed down and dropped off its sediments and built up this big delta at the base of the river where it flowed into the lake, and that made it difficult for the Kwee-wee to get up the river to spawn, which of course is where the Paiute people would be harvesting them every spring. In addition, the dam that was built blocked the cutthroat trout from spawning in the upper Truckee River. The Kwee-wee wouldn't swim that far upstream, but the cutthroat would, and the dam blocked them off. And so we see this drop in the Kwee-wee population, and that was a big impact on native traditions, not just for their traditional food supply, but for all those social aspects that were related to it. And then the particular species of cutthroat trout found in Pyramid Lake actually went extinct. Now they have replaced it with another related cutthroat trout subspecies. So it's not exactly the same as the ancestral one, but it's very similar. Well then, in probably the 80s or 90s, the Paiute tribe used the Endangered Species Act, and they regained some of the water flows. The way they set up the water flow was that they decided that the Paiute people should get X amount of water to use for farming. Well, they had never been farmers. They'd always been fishermen. And to have the fish survive, they needed more water than they were given for farming, which was not really part of their way of life. At any rate, they got some water flows, and specifically, they actually have control over Stampede Reservoir. So if you've ever been to Stampede, that water is specifically set aside for the Kwee-wee spawning in the spring. Basically, if it's a reasonable year of water flows, they will choose to release water from Stampede to raise the level of the Truckee River so that more of it flows down to Pyramid Lake to allow the Kwee-wee to get downstream. There's also 2 fish hatcheries that have been built, one for the cutthroat trout and one for the Kwee-wee. The trout fish hatchery is much more successful. The Kwee-wee don't really survive very long in captivity, so they have to be released as very small fish that are easily eaten by other fish and birds and so forth. And then, believe it or not, to get the Kwee-wee over the delta, they built a fish elevator. Basically, this elevator is part of a dam, and the fish swim upstream. They follow the current, and the current takes them into this box. And when the box is full, the people close the box, and then they lift it up 100 feet up and over the dam. This actually makes it very easy to keep track of the population of Kwee-wee as well, at least by counting the number that are attempting to spawn. And so that's reflecting their entire population. So they just set up a video camera where they're swimming into or probably swimming out of the elevator. So I don't know if you've ever been to Pyramid Lake, but it's a pretty amazing place. It's a desert lake, so it's very stark. Barren around it, but it has its own beauty as well. And here's the rock formation that it's named for. This pyramid is bigger than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. And these rock formations, you can see some way in the background too. These rock formations are formed by underwater hot springs. And remember, this is a mineral lake because water evaporates and the mineral content builds up. Well, the minerals in the lake have a chemical reaction with the minerals in the hot springs, and that forms these interesting rock formations. This type of rock is called tufa, and it takes on some pretty amazing shapes. Like these things right here are often hollow inside, and you can stand inside of them like you're on the top of a castle. It's an amazing thing. Now notice that the top of the pyramid is kind of brown, and then down here it's much paler. And these rocks over here are very pale, but right there they're brown. That is actually the old water line. So the light-colored rock was underwater before the Derby Dam was built. Before 1905, that light-colored rock was underwater. So that's how much the water level has dropped since that time period. Here's a picture of the Derby Dam. You drive right past it if you're going on I-80 between Reno and Salt Lake City. So there's the Truckee River on the left. It's flowing to the right. That is the actual Truckee River. And then this is the Truckee Canal, which takes, like I said, about half the water to the farms in Fallon. Here's the Kwee-Wee. So it's a bottom fish. It's a sucker fish. We would not really consider them a very desirable fish to eat. But again, it was a way of life. It wasn't just about the food quality. It was a great source of food that they could easily harvest in the desert, and it provided them with these great social opportunities and celebrations. And they're pretty big, as you can see. They're a couple feet long. And these guys, when they spawn, after they spawn, they swim back downstream to the lake. So they're not like a salmon that dies after spawning. They spawn multiple times. They might be 50 years old. They can live a long time, and they might not spawn for 5 years if there's not enough water coming down the stream. And then in a good water year, they will swim upstream to spawn. Here's the fish hatchery. You can see the guy working with the eggs. This appears to be more egg containers. Here's the young fish in these big vats, I guess you would call them. And this map is showing, first of all, the dotted lines show our state boundaries, right? So here's Nevada, dotted line. The heavy dark line is showing the boundary of the Great Basin. So anything within here, any rain that falls in here never reaches the sea. So it's all an isolated watershed. And then we see all of these circles are Ice Age lakes. This is where there was water in 10,000 years ago. For example, here's a huge lake, which was called Lake Bonneville. And as the Ice Ages ended, it was getting less water, and it shrunk down to the size of the Great Salt Lake. And that's one reason this is so salty, is because all of this dissolved minerals that were out here ended up down in the Great Salt Lake. Here's Pyramid Lake over here, part of this Lake Lahontan, which had a big mountain range in the middle of it, big giant island. But Pyramid Lake is one of the remnants of that. Walker Lake is a remnant of that. And here's Lake Tahoe, and as you can see, it was much bigger too. We think there was 500 feet deeper water in Tahoe during the Ice Ages. It would have gone up 500 feet higher than it is now. That would have been over the top of the Hyatt. I think we've looked at this map before, but just to get clear, of course, we live right about here, huh? Truckee River comes past Truckee, goes through Reno. Here's Derby Dam, flows down to Pyramid Lake. Here's where it would overflow to fill up Winnemucca Lake, which is now a dry lake most years. In a heavy winter, you know, there might be a foot of water in the valley there. Here's the Truckee Canal taking water to the town of Fallon and all their agricultural fields. And this is the Lahontan Reservoir, which was built to store water both from the Truckee River and combine it with the Carson River, passing through Carson City, and then filling up this reservoir, and then the water can be released to the farmers as needed. Excess water flows downhill to the Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge. Okay, that's it for Pyramid. So that one being close by, I had a lot to say about that one. So the rest of these should be a little shorter. So the Colorado River, again, a relatively nearby because it goes through Vegas. So the Colorado River flows from the the Rocky Mountains, and then ends up in the Gulf of California, also known as the Sea of Cortez. It ends up coming to the ocean between mainland Mexico and the Baja Peninsula. Along the way, it flows through the Grand Canyon, and it provides water for several states: Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, California, maybe New Mexico. There are several large dams on it that convert a lot of the fast-flowing river into a series of slow lakes, like Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And this has endangered many species of fish that were adapted for the fast currents in the river. Some of these fish are really, they look like they're humpbacked. They have huge shoulders, and it looks like they have this tiny neck. Well, that's because they have all these muscles in their back for swimming against the strong current. But now they're endangered because there's not that many parts of the river left that have a strong current. The Grand Canyon would be one of them. Sometimes the river dries up completely before reaching the sea, and it's not so much that it doesn't have enough water to get there, it's because we have taken out so much water before it gets there. So there was enough water coming down from the Rocky Mountains to reach the ocean, but along the way, we take out so much of it to meet the needs and desires of people that there's not always enough water to actually get to the sea. So this means the further downstream you are, the more likely you're going to have shortages of water, and potentially you're going to also experience poorer quality water. So here's a map of it. And again, I may not be giving you time to write everything down right now, but I'm going to post this in the class materials section. So here's where it comes through. The Grand Canyon is around here. Here's Lake Powell. Here's Lake Mead going all the way up here. And then it basically forms the border between Nevada and Arizona, and between California and Arizona, and then it flows out to Baja. So here's where the different dams are, and many of these are used to store water for use nearby. Other ones are primarily to make electricity. In one case, in one way or another, they're changing the river into a lake, and often they end up, you can see from space how big Lake Mead is. They often end up drowning part of that river valley that might have significant features. They could be archaeological sites that are now underwater because people would have lived along the river in the past. And so what often happened as they were building the dams, archaeologists would go there and try to excavate as much as they could, as fast as they could, which is not the best way to do archaeology, because sometimes if you go too fast, you can damage some of your finds. So they call it salvage archaeology when they're in a hurry like that. So they were doing salvage archaeology in the past. Now occasionally they do underwater archaeology. So imagine scuba diving onto an old Native American ceremonial site. Another thing would be that they often filled these valleys up that often had beautiful natural features. For instance, in Lake Powell, there were some incredible natural bridges of rock going, crossing through the air, kind of like maybe you've heard of Arches National Park, where there's these archways, and some of those have been lost underwater now. Here's Hoover Dam. I think there's a major change. So when these pictures were taken, the highway went across the top of the dam, but I think for security reasons, they decided to now build a bridge that takes cars over here and limit access to the top of the dam. They've also built a pedestrian walkway across here that's pretty incredible to walk across this big gorge. But you can see the drop from the water level up here to down here, and they're controlling that, and this is where the powerhouse would be, where they're going to have the turbines that are turned by the water flowing downhill. It's like a controlled waterfall. And as the water comes down, it spins the turbine, and then they can make electricity from it. The other thing I notice in this photo is this coloration. Just like at Pyramid Lake, you can see where the high water level was. When this photo was taken, the water level was quite low. This also shows you what water does when it interacts with minerals that have not been exposed to the water for some time. Okay, we're going to move on into Eastern Europe to talk about the Aral Sea, which is a small sea or a large lake, depending on how you look at it. It's between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So it used to be part of the Soviet Union, and now it's in these two independent countries. And water that flowed into that lake has been diverted for agriculture since it was part of the Soviet Union. So instead of allowing the water to flow down into the lake, they would divert it from a stream before the stream reached the lake. And this very similar to what's happening at Pyramid Lake and also nearby here in California at Mono Lake. So as a result, the Aral Sea, is not getting as much water as it used to. So it's shrunk dramatically, even beyond what we saw with Pyramid. And they actually have an air pollution problem because of this water quantity issue, where the exposed sediments create this dust pollution, and that's not good for people's respiratory systems. And basically all the fish have died out now. So the Aral Sea, largely a water quantity issue. Same thing for Pyramid and the Colorado River. So just to put you in perspective, you may know the Caspian Sea. Over here is the Black Sea, and off the corner of the screen would be the Mediterranean. So here's the Aral Sea. Let me see, before and after photos, satellite photos. Sorry about that. I thought this might show years. But here's the sea when it's full, and here's what it's been like lately. Basically, this basin having a little bit, this edge having some water, and then just spotty bits of lake up here. So a lot of the lake completely dry now. And of course, if you were a fisherman along the shore of that lake in the past, those days are over. This is crazy. A ship like this out in the desert, or camels feeding around a shipwreck. Basically, these boats were just abandoned when the water level dropped. Okay, moving on to our next one, Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has lots of oil, but does not have very much water. It is a desert region. So how do you get water to almost 30 million people when they live in the desert? Well, the good thing for Saudi Arabia is they're surrounded by ocean on several sides. So there's all that water available, but it's salt water, so we can't drink it because that salt would kill us due to osmosis. Well, why don't we just remove the salt from the water? This is called desalination. On the other hand, desalination requires a lot of energy. The reason for that is to desalinate water, basically you have to evaporate the water, and you have to be able to trap the steam as it evaporates. And then you condense the steam back down to liquid water. All the salts would be left behind when you first evaporated. Basically, we're going to distill the water. But to evaporate the water, we have to boil it, and that's where we have to use a lot of energy. Fortunately for Saudi Arabia, they have lots of oil and they have a lot of cash from selling oil, so they actually can afford to desalinate that ocean water. I think Israel may desalinate water as well because they're right on the ocean and have limited water supplies. So it's a good idea, but you have to have a good energy source to do it. That makes it expensive, and usually that energy source is going to create carbon when you're burning something to heat it up. So of course, all of these things can be summarized. You don't have to write down every single thing here. So here's a look at the location of Saudi Arabia on the Arabian Peninsula. They have access to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. This is a desalination plant. Okay, and then we have this side note of these other small countries. Bahrain is this island, and Dubai is a city in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And these guys, again, are oil rich. They're some of the richest countries per capita. And they also have some of the largest ecological footprints as a result. Look how they have built. I mean, this is a sculpted environment, isn't it? They've built these islands into these beautiful shapes, really. And they have these beautiful beaches, not very much water, so they have to desalinate. I believe it's Dubai that actually has an indoor ski resort. So imagine going skiing on a 105-degree day. 105 degrees outside, you go inside here and they've cooled it down so that you can ski down this slope. Doesn't look like a double diamond to me, but crazy. Ski in the desert. Oh, and they're providing all the sound, it looks like, huh? Okay, coming back to the US, coming back to California nearby, the California Aqueduct. So, as Los Angeles grew bigger and bigger, it soon started to run out of its own local water supplies. And so they started looking for more water in other areas and built what's known as the California Aqueduct. It's a whole long system of canals and reservoirs, tunnels, and pump stations that move water to Southern California, mostly from Eastern California and Northern California, taking all that water south. So there are issues that include controversies over water supplies in the Delta between Sacramento and San Francisco. Also, controversies about water supplies at Eastern Sierra lakes in the Eastern Sierra, specifically Mono Lake and Owens Lake. So in the Delta, some of the problems include sharing water between cities, farmers, and endangered species. And in the Eastern Sierra, it's mostly a quantity issue where these lakes have shrunk or dried up completely. So as you know, LA is on the ocean. Why don't they just desalinate like Saudi Arabia? Well, again, it's very expensive, and it turned out it was cheaper to build 500 miles worth of canals and reservoirs and tunnels than it was to desalinate the water. So here's some pictures of the California Aqueduct snaking across the landscape. Seems to me that it would be more efficient if this was covered, because then they wouldn't have losses from evaporation as it's going through Southern California in the summertime. Here it's in these pipes coming down this hill. And wouldn't that be smart? I don't know, maybe they have, but wouldn't it be smart if they had put some turbines in these pipes to make electricity while they were at it? Kind of a cogeneration scheme. Okay, so here's the two lakes that are impacted by the California Aqueduct that are both found on Highway 395. If you drive 395 south from Reno to Mammoth and keep going, you'll get to Owens Lake. Even before Mammoth, you go past Mono Lake. So Mono Lake's about 3 hours from Reno. It was fed by 7 different streams in the Sierras. And it is also a terminal lake. It's also a remnant of the ancient Ice Age Lake Lahontan. It's very salty. There are no fish there. But there are huge numbers of these brine shrimp and brine flies. And so many species come to the lake to feast on those shrimp and flies, especially during their migrations. So then the California Water Project, which included the aqueduct, diverted fresh water from those 7 streams. The lake level fell by 45 feet, and the lake was reduced to half its size. And this has exposed another set of tufa formations, like I was describing for Pyramid Lake. They're very similar, formed by underwater hot springs. These ones are these towers, kind of a different form of tufa, usually smaller, but maybe more dramatic. So I encourage you to go to Mono Lake just to see the tufa formations. They're pretty amazing. And recently they've had some of the water supplied to some of the water supplies to Mono Lakes have been restored. Owens Lake, on the other hand, is now completely dried up. And once again, this is now an air pollution problem when the wind picks up sediments off the dry lake bed. Owens Lake is down there by Lone Pine, if you've ever driven that way. So here's the map showing their locations, more or less. Here's a map of Mono Lake. It has a couple of volcanic islands in it, which it's actually in a pretty active volcanic area. You can find some nice bits of obsidian down here at the Mono craters. Not just bits, you can find big rocks of obsidian down there. And then these locations that are marked often have tufa formations on them. Here's some of the photos of the tufa. So imagine that this was underwater and these minerals are bubbling up from this hot spring, having a chemical reaction with the lake water and then forming a precipitate that sticks together to make these columns underwater. Then the lake level drops to expose them. And here's showing the old shorelines. And these are some of the creeks on the left here that have been dammed. Not so much dammed, more like just the creek now flows into a pipe that then flows south to LA. Oh, yeah, and I don't know if you know this band Pink Floyd, but they had this album called Wish You Were Here, and it included this photo taken at the tufa of Mono Lake as part of it. Okay, next one. The Columbia River comes down from Canada, goes through Washington, and forms the boundary between Washington and Oregon. So this is a huge river. When Lewis and Clark were sent up the Missouri, they were hoping that it would connect with the Columbia, because the Missouri River is another huge river, and if the two connected, that would mean that we could have ships moving goods and people from the east to the west easily by way of these rivers. Well, as we know now, they don't connect. The Rocky Mountains kind of got in the way. The Columbia River has a really big population of salmon of several different species. And so these are our classic salmon that live as adults in the ocean, and then they swim back upstream to spawn. Some of them swim hundreds of miles. Some of them even make it to northern Nevada. The Columbia River has a tributary, the Snake River, which has another tributary, the Owyhee River, and that comes out of Nevada. So there's actually salmon that spawn in Nevada and then swim to the ocean from Nevada. So obviously they are not part of the Great Basin because they can make it to the ocean. But it's still in Nevada. Today, 14 dams are on the main river, plus hundreds on the tributaries, and block a lot of these spawning runs. Many of these are primarily used to make electricity, which is good because there's no greenhouse gases. They're also used for the farmers, storing water for the farmers for irrigation. So what can we do to help the salmon? Well, some of the things they do is they've built fish ladders, which are kind of misnamed. I think they should be called fish stairways because the water's flowing down this set of stairways and the fish can jump from one step to the next to get around the dam. And that's a pretty dramatic thing to see. Many of these dams have visitor centers. And so if you go during spawning season, you can see these big fish jumping up these stairways to get around the dam. However, the small fish, the smolts, they don't take these fish ladders. They can't find them. And so they've had a big problem trying to keep the young ones alive and allow them to get to the ocean where they can grow up. They've actually taken to capturing these smolts, netting them, and then putting them on a barge that they can then take down the river. They've also removed some of the smaller dams that are no longer needed. So here's a map, and you can see all the numbers are dams that are on part of the Columbia River watershed. So the main river comes through here, reaches the ocean at Astoria, comes through Portland, works its way up here, and now it's only in Washington State, and it keeps working its way further north all the way up to British Columbia. Here we have the Snake River, which, as you can see, comes down further south, and here's the Owyhee River, which makes it into Nevada. There's another map, might be easier to see. Oh, actually, okay, here's where the Columbia goes. Right here, it turns north and goes up to British Columbia. This is all the Snake River down here, coming in from Idaho. So these are some fish jumping up these natural waterfalls. They're adapted to do that with the flowing water. And then this is what they were trying to make it past then. In the foreground, you can actually see one of these fish ladders, fish stairways, where they now jump from one level to the next. Oops. Here's a great view of a fish ladder, helping the fish get around this big dam. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Next, we're going to go to China and talk about the Three Gorges Dam. So this is the biggest hydroelectric dam in the world. It's on the Yangtze River, and it's also improved shipping on the river. It's provided irrigation for crops around the area, and it's also reduced flooding downstream. The dam is over a mile long, 300 feet high, and floods over 400 miles of, that should say, river valley. So 400 miles of the valley was flooded by this, and that means that many communities had to move. Over 1 million people had to relocate when they built this dam. Over 1,000 archaeological sites are now underwater, and any wildlife that needed a flowing river now has this huge dam to contend with. I just read that a fish that used to live there, it was 20 feet long. It was called the paddlefish, and they've just decided that it is now extinct. I just read that last week. So this had a big impact on people. They were basically environmental refugees that had to move. Where are they going to move to? What if most of your money is tied up in your property, and yet your property is going to be flooded by the rising river, by the rising reservoir? So what money do you end up having in order to buy a new property? Here's a map of the Yangtze River reaching the sea near Shanghai. Here's the Three Gorges Dam. Until COVID, I would have never known where Wuhan was. That's where we think the virus first jumped to people. Here's a map showing the flooding that occurred. So we can see that this was not a natural lake. So basically, when there's a lake that's pretty circular, you can figure it's natural. But when the lake has all these strange little extensions, that is a hint that it has flooded these valleys. So this is like a valley that's now been flooded by this lake water from building the Three Gorges Dam. Let's see. Actually, I take that back. Not from building the Three Gorges Dam, but again, this does not look like a natural lake to me. So this is where the reservoir is, along this part of river. World's largest dam, 100 towns submerged, many threatened species, including the Yangtze River dolphin, a dolphin that only lives in this river. Many landmarks were drowned, lost farmland. So this was another quantity issue, but in a sense, it's too much water instead of too little water by flooding this whole valley. Before and after pictures of the region. Okay, moving on back to the US. The Ogallala Aquifer is in the Great Plains. It is a huge reservoir of groundwater stretching from South Dakota to Texas. Almost a third of the groundwater used for irrigation in the US comes from the Ogallala Aquifer, and 2 million people drink water from it. But we've been overusing it. In other words, we've been using it faster than it can replenish. How do you get water back underground? Well, you have to let it basically percolate down through the soil, through the rock, to fill up the aquifer again. So the water table has dropped, and this sometimes causes the land to collapse. If there are these pore spaces that are no longer filled with water, then the weight of the ground above them can cause it to collapse. Now, we've talked about the Keystone XL pipeline that's been proposed. It would have to cross the aquifer. What happens if it leaks into that aquifer that is so important, providing so much irrigation water, and so many people drink from that aquifer? What if it gets filled with oil if there's a problem with that pipeline? So this would be a quality issue. Here's a quantity issue. We could end up depleting this aquifer within the next 50 years, and it would take 6,000 years to recharge it, to refill it, and that's if the landscape doesn't collapse above it. Here's a map showing the extent of the Ogallala Aquifer, reaching from South Dakota, Wyoming, a lot in Nebraska, all the way down to Texas. Here's another look at it, and it's showing where water has either increased or decreased. So the yellow and red where we've lost water from the aquifer, and blue where it's actually gained water. You can see the yellow and red is definitely dominant. Okay, next, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. This is off the mouth of the Mississippi. So where the Mississippi River reaches the Gulf of Mexico, it's bringing 40% of the runoff from the entire contiguous U.S. So 40% of the rain and snow that fall anywhere between Washington and Florida, between Maine and California, 40% of that water ends up flowing down the Mississippi. Along the way, it's going to pick up a lot of runoff, and this will often have excess fertilizer or excess pesticides or sewage. This means it's very high in nutrients. And when the nutrients reach the Gulf of Mexico, it causes algae to grow faster. We call it an algae bloom. So the nutrients in the runoff from fertilizer and sewage end up feeding the algae growth in the Gulf of Mexico. And the algae are short-lived cells, and so they're reproducing very rapidly, but they have a short lifespan, and so many of them are dying at the same time that many new algae are forming. And as the old algae decay, the bacteria end up reducing the amount of oxygen in the water. The bacteria use up the dissolved oxygen while decaying the excess dead algae. And that causes what we call a hypoxic zone in the deeper waters. Hypo means low, and oxic is a reference to oxygen. So low oxygen zone. And this hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico means that fish can't live there very well, or other creatures that need oxygen to live. So that's why we call it a dead zone. There are not very many living things there. Maybe if they're mobile, they didn't die there. They swam away from it, and just nothing is swimming back into it because they can't survive. So this hypoxic zone expands in the summer. And at that point, the dead zone is bigger than the state of Connecticut. Again, from fertilizers and sewage primarily, working their way down the Mississippi. And this is one of many dead zones found across the globe caused by this same issue of adding too many nutrients in one spot to the ocean. So this would be a water quality issue. There's a map showing the Mississippi watershed. So remember, any river that flows into the Mississippi is going to be part of its watershed. So you can see the Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Arkansas River, all of those and more flow into the Mississippi. And this entire light region is the Mississippi watershed. 40% of U.S. runoff is going to end up right here off the coast of Louisiana. Here's a map of the dead zone. Measurements of oxygen levels. When we measure dissolved oxygen in Tahoe, we usually find it around 7 or 8. So you can see this is half of that or worse. Okay, next, east coast of North America, the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the U.S. It's 200 miles long. It's in Maryland and Virginia, and runoff from many states flows into the bay. So once again, we're adding all kinds of nutrients to the bay along with other pollutants. And this bay has long been important for shipping, for fishing, and for tourism. But the water pollution from these farms, from cities, from factories, from sewage treatment plants, that all ends up in the Chesapeake Bay, which creates these dead zones. And that whole process is eutrophication, adding nutrients to the water. So we have dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay. We have industrial pollutants. And I don't know if I'd want to eat an oyster from there because oysters filter the water, which means whatever's in the water, they're acquiring in their bodies. Here's a map of the Chesapeake Bay. Coming up here. And Washington, D.C. is right nearby here as well. There it is. It's actually part of the bay. Whoops, I lost my pointer. Here's Washington, D.C. So this river, the Potomac that comes down here, I think it's the Potomac, you can see it's part of the bay. At high tide, water is going to flow up further. So this is all this giant estuary, 200-mile-long estuary, and it's going to be picking up runoff from all of these communities. Here's some of the organisms that live at the Chesapeake Bay. Let's see, and this is showing some of the issues there. Wastewater, sewage, stormwater runoff, industrial contaminants, ship traffic, dams. All of these have impacts on these creatures. Here's some more details about it. I think we're going to move on. It's showing how an estuary has this combining seawater, salt seawater with fresh ocean water, and as the tides move it back and forth, the boundary between them changes, the salinity increases as you move closer to the ocean, and so on. This is showing cycles with some of the pollutants. Okay, Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I think we've talked about these. Basically, there's spiral currents that are called a gyre that concentrate the floating garbage. Comes from both land and sea. The Pacific Garbage Patch estimated to be twice the size of Texas. And it's not just the visible trash that we see, it's also the microscopic little bits of plastic in between there. There's a map showing the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And here's some other diagrams showing we have these big concentrations in these spiral gyres. One, the eastern garbage patch, the western garbage patch, and then kind of stretching between them. Some photos. This is a piece of art meant to invoke the famous wave Japanese painting with Mount Fuji in the background, but this is all made using garbage from the ocean. Here's a close-up view of it. Huh. Okay, last one, Cape Town in South Africa. In 2018, the city was severely threatened. They'd had several years of drought in a row, and their water supplies were running low, to the point that their reservoirs were below 25% of their capacity. I think I read 13%. And the city started planning for what they called day zero. And they actually had a countdown clock, this many days till day zero. And on that day, they were going to shut off all the water supplies. You would not be able to turn on your sink, your shower, your faucet would not have any water come out of it on day zero. At that point, you could only get water by waiting in line to get your daily ration. You might have only gotten 2 gallons a person or something like that. Well, fortunately, these guys acted ahead of the game and started conserving water. They reduced their water use by half. Imagine using half the water you use on a normal day. And that delayed the arrival of day zero to the point that the rains returned. And that refilled the reservoir at least up to 70% of capacity. And this is kind of a cautionary tale because it's the first major city that was actually considering shutting off their water supplies. That would have been a huge thing. Imagine if you couldn't just go get your water. Not be a fun thing, right? And that's all I have for you. I want to thank you for sticking with me. I will post this if you want to add anything to that. But again, all that stuff can be summarized. So I'm going to say goodbye, and I'm going to turn off the video. And if anybody wants to stick around, if you have questions, or we can talk.